Right now, at this very moment, someone somewhere in the world is playing Monopoly. Maybe it's a family gathering where tempers are about to flare over who gets Park Place. Maybe it's a rainy afternoon where friendships will be tested over Baltic Avenue. For over 80 years, this game has been tearing families apart and destroying relationships, and we all keep coming back for more. But here's the thing that'll make you furious. The entire story you've been told about where Monopoly came from is a lie. Everything you think you know about Charles Darrow inventing this game during the Great Depression? Fiction. A carefully constructed myth designed to hide the truth about a brilliant woman who created the world's most famous board game in 1904 and got paid $500 while a man who copied her work became a millionaire. Her name was Elizabeth Magie, and she didn't just invent Monopoly. She invented it for a specific reason that the company who stole it deliberately erased. The game you've been playing your entire life, it was supposed to teach you something completely different from what it teaches you now. And the story of how it was stolen and transformed into the opposite of what she intended might be the most perfect example of irony in the history of American capitalism. Stay with me, because this gets wild. Picture this. It's 1866, and Elizabeth "Lizzie" Magie is born in Macomb, Illinois, into a world that has very specific ideas about what women should be and do. Victorian America wants her to be quiet, obedient, ornamental. It wants her to find a husband, have children, disappear into domesticity, and never cause trouble. Elizabeth Magie looks at all of that and says, absolutely not. She becomes a stenographer, supporting herself financially at a time when respectable women weren't supposed to work. She becomes a newspaper reporter, asking uncomfortable questions in a profession dominated by men. She performs as a comedian and stage actress, standing on stages and making people laugh when women were supposed to be seen and not heard. She teaches herself engineering principles. She writes essays about women's independence that make people uncomfortable. She remains unmarried well into her 40s, not because no one would have her, but because she refused to accept marriage as a state of dull dependence. In one letter that would later be preserved, Elizabeth wrote something that perfectly captures who she was. Let me tell the women how to get freedom, by being independent in thought and action, by developing the brain power to maintain that independence, by learning to look upon marriage only as a fuller and richer opportunity for development and work instead of a state of dull dependence. This was not a woman who was going to fade quietly into the background. But Elizabeth Magie wasn't just a feminist rebel challenging gender norms, though that alone would have made her remarkable. She was also deeply influenced by the economic theories of her time, particularly the work of Henry George, an economist and political philosopher whose father had embraced. George argued that the economic value of land belongs to society as a whole, not to individual property owners, and that a single tax on land value could solve poverty and inequality. These were radical ideas. They challenged the fundamental assumptions of American capitalism. And Elizabeth Magie, brilliant and creative and absolutely unwilling to just talk about change, decided to do something unprecedented. She decided to teach these complex economic concepts through a board game. Think about how audacious that is. This is the early 1900s. Board games are for children and idle entertainment. Nobody uses games to communicate serious political and economic philosophy. But Elizabeth Magie sees what others don't. That people learn through play, that you can demonstrate complex systems through simple mechanics, that a game might change minds where essays and speeches fail. In 1904, she receives patent number 748626 for her invention, the Landlord's game. Here's where this story gets absolutely fascinating, because when you look at the Landlord's game, the game Elizabeth Magie created in 1904, you're looking at something that will sound incredibly familiar. It's played on a square board with a continuous path around the perimeter. Players move according to dice rolls. There are properties you can purchase, railroad spaces, utilities, a jail space, and even a corner specifically labeled Go to Jail. When you pass the starting corner, which Magie labeled Mother Earth, you collect $100. Does this sound familiar? It should. These are the exact foundational mechanics of Monopoly. Every single element that you think Charles Darrow invented in the 1930s, Elizabeth Magie designed them in 1904, 30 years earlier. But here's the thing that makes Magie's original game absolutely brilliant and completely different from the Monopoly we know. It came with two completely different sets of rules. Under the prosperity rules, when wealth was created through property development, all players benefited. There was a mechanism built into the game that distributed profits. The goal wasn't to crush your opponents, but to demonstrate how an economy could work if wealth creation lifted everyone. This was Maggie's vision of how Henry George's economic theories would function in practice, a system where prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. Under the monopolist rules, the second set, players competed to accumulate wealth and property, driving opponents into bankruptcy through ruthless acquisition and development. This was the version that demonstrated everything Magie believed was wrong with unregulated capitalism. She wanted players to experience how monopolistic practices crushed people, how wealth concentration created poverty, how the system she was critiquing actually felt from the inside. It is a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences, Magie wrote in a political magazine. It might well have been called the game of life, as it contains all the elements of success and failure in the real world. This is the crucial thing to understand. Elizabeth Magie created this game as a teaching tool. She wanted players to compare the two rule sets, to feel the difference between an economic system based on shared prosperity and one based on monopolistic competition. She wanted them to see which version was more enjoyable, more fair, more sustainable. She wanted to change minds through direct experience. After receiving her patent, the Landlord's game began spreading through progressive academic circles. Economics professors at the Wharton School of Finance, Columbia University, the University of Pennsylvania, they started using Maggie's game in their classrooms. Students played it, then created their own handmade versions to take home, adapting the board with local street names and landmarks. This is important. The game spread organically for decades, moving from person to person, community to community, mutating slightly as it traveled. By the 1920s, versions of the Landlord's game were being played across the country, including at a Quaker community in Atlantic City who adapted it using the now famous Atlantic City street names. In 1924, Magie released a revised version through her own economic game company, doubling down on the educational emphasis. She was still trying to teach, still trying to change the conversation about economic justice through this remarkable game she'd created. And then, in the early 1930s, everything went wrong. The Great Depression is crushing America. Unemployment is devastating. People are desperate. And in this moment of national crisis, an unemployed heating engineer named Charles Darrow is taught a version of the Landlord's game by a friend. The version Darrow learns includes the Atlantic City street names. It includes all of Elizabeth Magie's mechanics, the board structure, the property acquisition, the rent collection, everything. Darrow didn't invent any of it. He learned it from someone else, who learned it from someone else, in a chain that ultimately goes back to Maggie's 1904 creation. But Charles Darrow sees something different from what Magie intended. He doesn't see an educational tool. He doesn't see a critique of capitalism. He sees a commercial opportunity. Darrow begins producing his own versions of the game, which he calls Monopoly. He sells them in Philadelphia department stores, and here's the crucial detail. He presents himself as the inventor. He doesn't mention Elizabeth Magie. He doesn't mention the decades of evolution the game went through. He doesn't acknowledge that he learned this game from someone else. He claims it as his own creation. In 1935, Parker Brothers, one of the largest game manufacturers in America, purchases Darrow's version of Monopoly and begins mass producing it. The game is an immediate, explosive hit. In its first year alone, Monopoly sells 278,000 copies. Charles Darrow, credited as the sole inventor, becomes the first board game designer in history to become a millionaire. Let that sink in. A millionaire. From a game he didn't create. But here's where it gets even more infuriating.
Parker Brothers discovers Elizabeth Magie's patent. They realize there's a legal problem. This woman has documentation proving she invented the core mechanics of the game they just purchased. They recognize the potential for a lawsuit that could destroy their new cash cow. So what do? They pay Elizabeth Magie $500 for the rights to the Landlord's game and 2 other game concepts she'd created. $500. To put this in perspective, Parker Brothers will go on to make hundreds of millions of dollars from Monopoly over the next decades. Charles Darrow is becoming fabulously wealthy, and Elizabeth Magie, the actual inventor, receives $500 and a promise. What promise? Parker Brothers tells Magie they'll produce her original Landlord's game alongside Monopoly. They'll give her creation the recognition it deserves. They'll market it properly. They lied. Parker Brothers did technically produce some copies of the Landlord's game, just enough to fulfill their legal obligation, but they never seriously marketed it. They buried it. And more importantly, they began actively promoting the myth that Charles Darrow was the sole inventor of Monopoly, that he'd come up with this brilliant idea during the Depression, that it was his flash of genius that created the game. For the next several decades, this became the official story. Every Monopoly box, every article, every history of the game, all of them credited Charles Darrow as the inventor. Elizabeth Magie's name disappeared from the narrative entirely. When a Washington Post reporter tracked down Magie in 1936 and asked her about the situation, you can hear the frustration and disappointment in what she said. There is nothing new under the sun. Monopoly is not a new game at all. It has been played for years before Mr. Darrow discovered it in 1933. We played it in 1904. But hardly anyone was listening. The Darrow myth was too convenient, too perfect, a Depression-era American success story about an unemployed man who pulled himself up by inventing a game. It was exactly the kind of narrative people wanted to believe. The truth about a feminist game designer with radical economic ideas, that story didn't sell as well. Here's where this story becomes almost too perfect, almost too symbolic to believe, except it's absolutely true. Elizabeth Magie created the Landlord's game specifically to critique monopolistic capitalism. She wanted to demonstrate how concentrating wealth and property in the hands of a few people creates poverty and suffering for everyone else. She wanted players to experience both an economic system based on shared prosperity and one based on monopolistic competition.
A corporation discovered her creation, recognized its commercial value, purchased the rights for a tiny fraction of what it was worth, buried her contribution, promoted a false origin story, and made hundreds of millions of dollars while the actual creator received almost nothing. The game, designed to critique monopolies, was itself monopolized. And then, and this is the part that would probably make Elizabeth Magie laugh or cry or both, the cooperative prosperity rules she created were completely forgotten. The educational dimension was stripped away. The alternative economic model she wanted people to experience, gone. What remained was only the monopolist rules, the version that was supposed to be the cautionary tale, the version that demonstrates ruthless capitalism, where you accumulate property, charge rent, bankrupt your opponents, and pursue total market dominance without mercy. And people loved it. Monopoly became the best-selling commercial board game in history precisely because it lets players be the monopolists. It celebrates exactly what Magie wanted to critique. Families gather around the board and gleefully destroy each other's finances. Children learn that the goal is to own everything and eliminate the competition. The game has become a training tool for exactly the economic mindset Magie hoped to challenge. The transformation is complete. A game created as progressive economic education became a celebration of capitalist competition. A critique became an endorsement. The warning became the manual. This isn't just corporate theft, it's the theft of meaning itself.
For decades, Elizabeth Magie remained erased from history. She married at age 44, taking the name Elizabeth Magie Phillips, and continued inventing games and receiving patents throughout her life. When she died in 1948, at age 82, the public had largely forgotten her. Meanwhile, Monopoly continued its trajectory toward becoming a cultural phenomenon, generating enormous profits, with Charles Darrow firmly established as its creator in the public imagination. The truth might have stayed buried forever if not for a professor named Ralph Ansbach. In the 1970s, Ansbach created a game called Anti-Monopoly, which critiqued monopolistic business practices. Parker Brothers sued him for trademark infringement, and Ansbach began researching the history of monopoly to defend himself in court. What he discovered was stunning: documentary evidence of Elizabeth Magie's patent, testimonies from people who had played the Landlord's game decades before Darrow's version existed, proof that the entire Darrow creation myth was false. Ansbach's legal battle brought Magie's story back into the light, though it would take decades more before historians and game scholars fully appreciated the scope of her contribution and the injustice of her erasure. Books like Mary Pillen's The Monopolists in 2015 finally brought Elizabeth Magie's story to a wider audience, challenging the long-established narrative and giving this remarkable woman her due recognition. But here's what makes me think about Elizabeth Magie's story in 2025. How many other women's contributions have been minimized, attributed to male colleagues, or simply erased from historical records? How many other brilliant innovations were stolen, their creators paid a pittance, while others became wealthy? How many other original meanings have been transformed into their opposites as ideas moved through culture and commerce? Elizabeth Magie's legacy extends far beyond a board game. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about who gets credit for innovation, about how capitalism treats creative work, about the ways corporate interests shape historical narratives, and about how women's intellectual contributions have been systematically devalued throughout history. The ultimate lesson of Elizabeth Magie's life might be this: she created something so compelling, so fundamentally engaging, that it survived being completely stripped of its original purpose. The mechanics she designed were so elegant that even when divorced from her political message, they created one of the most enduring games in human history. That's the power of great design. It transcends intention, but it's also a tragedy, because millions of people have played Monopoly without ever knowing they were supposed to be learning something deeper, something about economic justice and the dangers of unchecked capitalism. Today, when you play Monopoly, when you pass go and collect your $200, when you buy Boardwalk, when you bankrupt your uncle over Bollidick Avenue, you're participating in a century-old conversation about wealth, property, and economic justice. You're experiencing the mechanics designed by a feminist game designer who dared to challenge economic orthodoxy through the seemingly simple medium of a board game. You're playing Elizabeth Magie's game, even if the box says someone else invented it. And maybe now that you know the truth, you'll play it differently. Maybe you'll think about those forgotten prosperity rules. Maybe you'll consider what it means that the version designed to warn us about monopolies became the only version we play. Maybe you'll wonder what Elizabeth Magie would think about the world we've built, a world where her game is played by hundreds of millions of people who have no idea she existed. The next time someone tells you Charles Darrow invented Monopoly, you can tell them the truth. You can rescue one more woman from historical erasure. You can help correct a lie that's been told for 80 years. Elizabeth Magie deserved better than $500 and decades of obscurity. She deserved credit for her brilliance, recognition for her vision, and a world that actually learned the lesson she was trying to teach. The least we can do is remember her name.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it. That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.